Hey freaks, it's JJ. Welcome to my channel. If you're new here, I chat a lot about rock and metal music, and I also talk about some of my favorite concept albums and the stories that go behind them. So today we are talking about one of my favorite bands, Fleshgod Apocalypse, and their 2016 album, King. Before we get started, please hit subscribe if you want to support what I do here, and if you want to get notified when I put out other content such as this. So this album, at its core, I think represents more of the dark side of human nature. And I think it kind of seeks to explore, the more malicious motivations that can tempt us while in pursuit of, success or fulfillment in our lives. So each song introduces a new character within a royal court. And aside from the king, each character embodies, a form of corruption or espouses some kind of sinister vice or another. So the album starts off with track 1, Marsh Royale, which is an instrumental track and I think just really starts off setting the scene of this royal court. And that flows perfectly into Adenternium, which is track 2, and this is taken from the king's perspective. So the king here has been fighting against a people who don't really believe in him, maybe, and a court who would rather, betray them than support him, and, people who want to usurp his throne if he shows any kind of weakness. And so this king kind of has these old school values of honor, respect, and obedience, and he's really just like a man's man. He understands that in order to properly rule a kingdom, you have to be steadfast in proving your strength. And maybe at times, your show of power might be brutal, but it is necessary in the world that he lives in, one which is wrought with betrayal and backstabbing and corruption. So then we move on to track number 3, Healing Through War, which is probably the heaviest track on the album. And this is about the Minister of War. So the Minister of War has been growing tired of all the bloodshed recently. Maybe he's starting to question his role and despise how, it falls on him to dirty his hands in order to bow to the desires of these corrupt and greedy men. And he's really just a pawn in the larger scheme of politics. So although he may be a little bit jaded by his position, he's kind of grown to accept his purpose and even embraces his role as sort of an angel of death. So then we move on to track number 4, The Fool. So this is obviously told from the perspective of the king's fool, and it is his job to bring happiness to the king and kind of bring the king a sort of reprieve from the stress of ruling a kingdom beside, a malicious court full of people that would, breathe treason with every breath. And so this is a lot of pressure on the fool. He finds that he's been pretending for so long that he no longer knows who he is or what his purpose is. He's been bowing to other people's needs for so long that he's become sort of lost, to the point where he is severely abusing alcohol and struggles with suicidal desires. We then move on to track number 5, Cold as Perfection. And this is told from the Queen's perspective, which obviously if you've seen the music video, it's very clear. The Queen has this obsession with perfection to the point of self-harm. In the pursuit of this impossible desire, she kind of ends up losing herself to madness, and she begins to be unfaithful to the king, seeking pleasure in other men's affections in order to kind of quell her waning self-esteem and this dysphoria of her own aging appearance. Eventually, she comes to the conclusion that, if she cannot reach this impossible standard of perfection, she doesn't want to live any longer, and she ends up taking her own life, as shown in the music video. We then move on to track number 7, Mitra. I don't know how you say it. Mitra, one of those. Anyway, this song is about the bishop. And this bishop has certainly fallen from grace, and he uses his position to seduce women by insinuating that it is God's will that they sleep with him. So the bishop in his abuse of power is, I just think, unrivaled against the other characters in this album. And in my opinion, I think it's probably one of the most deplorable characters in this cast. We then move on to track number 7, Paramore. And something in German, which I'm not going to try and pronounce because I know I'll butcher it, but basically it translates roughly to passion brings suffering. And this is told by the king's mistress. So she is conflicted, I believe. She wants to be free of her desires, but she can't help returning to the king every chance that she gets. She knows that their relationship will only bring her continued heartbreak, but she can't help but love him. So the lyrics to this track were actually taken from the German poet Goethe in his poem Reconciliation, which in my interpretation is kind of about the total inability to escape from this lustful desire driven by not love but more like an infatuation with another person. That may not be the necessarily correct interpretation, but that's just how I read it. And it's also originally in German, so as far as like translation goes, things might not be perfect there. Moving on to track number 8, The Vulture Beholds. So this is about the prince. And the prince, he is this lazy, arrogant, pompous kind of jerk. And he wants his kingdom, and he wants it now. He's been ignored and ridiculed by his father, who does not believe that he is strong enough to rule. And so the prince eventually grows tired of his father's criticism and decides to conspire to kill him, and so that he can take the throne for himself. So whether or not the prince is successful in this gambit, I'm not really sure, but I think he at least makes an attempt on his father's life. And I would like to think that the king in this story is strong enough that he would not fall for it or fall victim to the prince's planning. But that's just my opinion. We then move on to track number 9, Gravity. This is about the Master of Coin, and what else could this possibly be about but greed? So this Master of Coin is totally aware of his addiction to wealth, and it's kind of driven him to the really, the depths of corruption, but he doesn't care anymore. He's accepted it, and he just continues to feed his insatiable lust for wealth. Track number 10, A Million Deaths. This song is told from the perspective of a soldier or general on the front lines, and it begins with the character believing in the glory and the honor of battle and war. However, as time goes on, the soldier or general becomes disenchanted after witnessing all the devastation that war brings. He feels like his king has abandoned him, and despite the king's attempt at reassurance, he is slowly becoming disenchanted by everything going on around him. The soldier believes that war has both devastated and damned his soul, along with all of his soldiers, and he doesn't even understand why the war is happening, or he doesn't believe in the cause in the first place. And it could also be seen that maybe the soldier or general doesn't want to take possession of the things that he's done and the awful things that the awful crimes he's committed in war, and so he tries to push it off on someone else, saying that you forced me to do it, without ever actually taking ownership for his own sins. That takes us to track number 11, Syphilis. And I've heard that this track, and I've heard people explain this track as taking place from the perspective of the king's mistress again, but we already did her, so I think that this track is taken from the perspective of the princess, who is writing to her father for help while also begging her lover for forgiveness after she finds out that she's contracted STD, i.e. syphilis. So, she begs both her father and her lover to forgive her, but in the end she is rejected by her lover and disowned by her father, the king. So that takes us to our final track on the album, King, which is again just an instrumental track, and that kind of brings us all the way back to the beginning, full circle, and it really shines the light on the king, proving that he is the only decent character in this cast of, miscreants. And I think this track also serves to highlight the moral theme of the album, which is this idea that, all these characters live inside of us, and, they tempt us in some way or another, but we must choose which aspects of ourselves to embrace and which to deny in order to become our best versions of ourselves. So, that is all for Fleshgod Apocalypse album King. Thank you for watching if you've reached the end of this video. Again, if you want to support what I do here, then please hit subscribe if you haven't already. Also, if you want to join me, I host a Metalhead community where I send out monthly newsletters with extra tidbits on concept albums and some bonus content. Then go down to the link in the description and sign up for my newsletter. Thanks again for watching, freaks.